Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Kartik Krishnaiyer.
And I'm Robert Buccellato.
So today, Robert, we're going to tackle one of the most controversial and, quite frankly, embarrassing figures in Florida history, Governor Sidney Catts, who was elected in 1916 as a third-party candidate of the Prohibition Party. He ran on that ticket after barely losing the Democratic primary earlier that year. He was a noted racist and anti-Catholic bigot. He was someone who was really a demagogue and kind of fit the populist fervor in the South of the early 20th century. In the 19-teens, the Ku Klux Klan had come back as a major force in American politics after the screening of Birth of the Nation, the D.W. Griffith movie, based on the book The Klansman by Thomas Dixon, who was a noted writer from North Carolina at that time, and used a platform of racial fear-mongering and even crazy suggestions like the papacy was going to relocate to Florida to almost win the Democratic nomination for governor, but then run in the general election and win on the Populist Party ticket, on the Prohibition Party ticket. Figure.
One of the great and interesting things about Sidney Catts, and people aren't really aware of it, but he was only one of two candidates from the Prohibitionist ticket that ever won statewide office. And he was the only governor in the history of the nation who was a Prohibitionist. And basically what happened was he was a evangelical Christian, lost his eye in a freak accident when he was younger, got very, very fiery and deeply, deeply religious, a terribly prejudiced man. He had these, you don't really see it in the photos, because by the time the photos came along, he was an old man with gray hair. But growing up, he had these, these fiery red hair locks. And he was just intense. Anybody that saw him, particularly when he was governor, and particularly when he was a younger man, they said that he was just an intense person. And I think what is so interesting about him is, and what is so unusual for him in relation to his successors and his predecessors, is you can look at their record. You can look at the photo history and the documentation that is still around about them, and you get a pretty good idea about who they were, where they stood for, their overall dynamic and their personality. You can't do that with Sidney Catts. You really just had to experience it. And that's what everybody said. He was just this walking, talking tidal wave of emotion and charisma and racism. And what ended up happening was he ran for Congress a few times and lost badly. And, he had his own congregation. He was a very successful pastor. And then he goes to the governor's mansion. This was about, 1912, 1911, around there. And he finds out that this big, beautiful antebellum mansion is basically the perk, the trophy, the main perk of the job for the governor's mansion. I mean, for the governor when he's in office. This whole entire mansion, you get to live there rent-free, and you get a servant, and you get a horse, and, all of these things he found out when he was there. And that was the first time that he started to show any interest in running for governor. The whole fact that there was this big old mansion that would be his if he would run. As I said, a terribly racist man. He also had a horrible temper. He shot an African-American man at point-blank range with a shot-off shotgun in the 1890s. But he was also, and that's the frustrating thing about Sidney Catts, was he had a determined spirit. And so there's one or two nuggets in his personality that I guess I hesitate to say admire, but you can, I guess, acknowledge would be probably as far as I would go with that. You could acknowledge the value in his determination and even his self-confidence. But apart from that, he was a pretty reprehensible person.
Yeah.
There's really the best you could say about him. And so he ran basically on this platform, which was, rum, faith, and racism in a nutshell. It was when, you and me both talk about this in the book that we wrote, Rum Runners. I mean, it was a time when the entirety of the state and the nation was divvied up between the dries and the wets. And so they were either pro or they were anti-prohibition. It was a very hotly contested and divided issue, and it was a very emotional issue. And as we've seen in recent years, if you are somebody that is willing to champion an idea that might not be attractive, might not be likable, but has a very devout following, you more times than not get elected to things that nobody would ever imagine you would be elected to. I don't know if I need to hit the head for that analogy any harder, but
address. Yeah, Robert, we see it all over the world. It's populism. Nigel Farage has just done fairly well with the Reform Party in the British elections, 2024 general election. Obviously, Donald Trump in the United States, and J.D. Vance, and Marine Le Pen and her party in France led the first round of elections there. They finished third in the runoffs. But populism is growing. We see it in the Netherlands. We see it everywhere, and it's always been around. And populism has different forms. And Sidney Catts was certainly a populist. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about how he began his tenure as governor, giving an inaugural address on the steps of the old Capitol, or what was the capital at the time, in Tallahassee. Your triumph is no less in this good hour in beautiful Florida, for you have withstood the onslaughts of the county and state political rings, the corporations, the railroads, the fierce opposition of the press, and the organization of the Negro voters of this state against you, and the power of the Roman Catholic hierarchy against you. Yet over all of these, the common people of Florida, the everyday cracker people, have triumphed. He continued to float this theory while he was in office that the Holy See would be moving to Florida, and all the Protestant congregations would be shut down, and everyone would be forcibly converted to Catholicism. And people believed it. It was the crazy thing.
For those listening, I don't know how much knowledge they have in the papacy, but at the time, the Pope was Pope Benedict the 15th, and he is known as the Peace Pope. If there was going to be a Pope of the 20th century that was going to scheme to infiltrate Florida or the nation, that was not the Pope. He was a very humane person. He was very timid, and he was very kindly. But, he made this scholarly man, this pious man, into a monster, and he did that with an entire race of people. And while we're doing quotes, there's a very famous quote from his chief of staff that said, "The average Floridian only has 3 friends: Sears Roebuck, God, and Sidney Catts."
Yep, that is a famous quote. Another infamous quote of of Sidney Catts was after a few lynchings in his term in office in 1919. He was quoted saying, "Only the vagrant, vagabond, worthless Negro is lynched," and he responded to the NAACP complaining about these lynchings, and I think we mentioned on a previous episode Woodrow Wilson's time in the White House coincided. Woodrow Wilson, quite possibly the greatest racist ever to occupy that high office. The screening of The Birth of the Nation, pro-Ku Klux Klan movie with a very odd telling of the history of Reconstruction, of post-Civil War era. That movie inflamed the country, right? And the Ku Klux Klan used it as a major recruiting tool. So by that movie, D.W. Griffith movie, came out in 1915. By 1917, 1918, the Klan was really strong. They had tacit support from the man in the White House. They would eventually try and get his son-in-law, William Gibbs McAdoo, nominated by the Democrats in 1924. McAdoo, as you know, was very close to being nominated.
It was.
And the Klan essentially controlled that convention in 1924. So the Democratic Party was the party of the Ku Klux Klan at the time. So this gave Catts, who was a Democrat, even though he had to run as a prohibitionist after barely losing the Democratic nomination to get elected, said, and I quote, "Your race is always harping on the disgrace it brings to the state by a concourse of white people taking revenge for the dishonoring of a white woman, when if you would teach your people not to kill our white officers and disgrace our white women, you would keep down 1,000 times greater distance." Now, this is directly the sort of rhetoric that came from The Birth of the Nation film, screened at the White House by Woodrow Wilson. One of Woodrow Wilson's quotes was at the beginning of that film. Sidney Catts was the embodiment of that. He took that phony living history, made it reality, and applied it as governor to justify his absolutely maniacal racist behavior.
And you mentioned Birth of the Nation, and what is so interesting is Sidney Catts is really a human embodiment of the two main themes of Birth of a Nation. This great technological advancement. It was the Titanic, the Lord of the Rings of its day, mixed with this very prejudiced underlying message. Sidney Catts, he was the first person to really create the barnstorming method of campaigning. His campaign was revolutionary. He drove around all throughout the state on a Model T, first candidate to travel by an automobile. His inauguration was the first inauguration to be filmed. There were a lot of things about his candidacy that was designed to basically excite the average rural voter whose most of his social life, when it wasn't about agriculture, when it wasn't about commerce, was already roped around the whole concept of candidates coming into the square. And you now have this candidate who comes in to, do his little politic, and there'd be barbecues and stuff. But instead of a carriage or on foot, he's driving a Model T. Many of these people had never seen a car before. And so he basically had that sort of edge where it was almost exciting to vote for Sidney Catts. He was a Democrat, absolutely. He was also an outsider. He was running against the comptroller at the time, and at first it seemed like he had won the nomination, but he claimed it was party shenanigans that actually robbed him of the nomination. But what ended up happening was there was a few precincts that hadn't reported, and it was a very close primary. And then those precincts, I think they added about another 100 or 2 away from his margin. And essentially, if I'm not mistaken, it was a tied or a hung vote, and the party elders got to select who the nominee was. And of course, they didn't select Catts. So you have this message of anti-racism, of pro-racism, anti-establishment. And it probably was an asset for him not to win the primary as opposed to winning the primary, because he then used it as another example of how he was an ordinary man. The establishment was trying to steal from him, as they always steal from you, and it paid rich dividends. He ran as an independent and a third party, and he swamped the Democrats.
Yeah. And obviously, as we've talked about many times, the Republicans were not a factor in elections in Florida after African Americans were effectively disenfranchised prior to the massive influx of residents from the Midwest and parts of the Northeast that registered as Republicans down here and made the Republican Party of Florida, at least prior to the Civil Rights era, somewhat of an odd party, because they were very conservative on fiscal issues, but had this liberalism on civil rights that no one else had in the state. So, but this was the era when no Republican could get elected. Sometimes they wouldn't even run candidates. So basically, it was the Democratic nominee against Sidney Catts, and Sidney Catts was able to win with the masses of the Democratic base in rural Panhandle, Florida, supporting him. So the aftermath of Catts is after 1920, he's out of office, but Kerry Hardy comes in as the governor. We have the Rosewood lynching. We have a number of other very, very terrible race-based crimes in the state of Florida. Florida per capita produces more lynchings in the early part of the 20th century than any other state in the country, more than Mississippi, more than South Carolina, even though you had people like Theodore Bilbo and James K. Vardaman running around in Mississippi, and all the descendants of Pitchfork Ben Tillman and company running around in South Carolina. So Florida, the legacy of Sidney Catts is one, and also the anti-Catholicism. Al Smith lost Florida in 1928, based largely around his religion. At a time when a Republican could not get elected in the state, the Republican nominee carried Florida because the Democratic nominee was a Catholic. That is the only reason he lost the state of Florida. So the racism, the violent racism, which defended lynching, as I read the passage earlier, and the anti-Catholicism, Catts, actually became very mainstream in Florida politics over the next 15 to 20 years until influx of people during and right after the Second World War changed things.
And, it should be noted that when Catts actually got into office, he did not govern as a prohibitionist. He didn't govern as a reformist or somebody with very high-minded ideas. He governed as a bourbon Democrat. He basically got all of his family on the payroll, all of his supporters on the payroll. The only real thing that he ever stuck his neck out on was the 18th Amendment and making sure that Florida voted wet to eliminate alcohol. Famously, he didn't go to his inaugural ball because he claimed that the punch was spiked. Which is very ironic because even though he was this very anti-alcohol, he actually drew up lesson plans and insisted that all of the teachers statewide give these indoctrinated lessons on the virtues of taking the pledge of not drinking and prohibition, something which would be, totally unheard of today in any state, in any part of this country. But oddly enough, when he was out of office, he tried to run for the U.S. Senate, lost badly, and ended up going into business selling a tonic, a medicine, which most of it was alcohol.
Correct. Anyway, we're going to leave it here. Robert, thank you once again. We'll be back next week with another new edition of the Florida History Podcast. And I'm sure, regardless of who we talk about, he will not be as lamentable a figure in Florida history as Sidney Catts.